Hello there and welcome to your R06 pre-case study exam technique video. My name is Dean Scott, a Chartered Financial Planner. I'm part of a training team which has been involved with the R06 exam, whether that be writing materials or delivering face-to-face training for the past decade. The purpose of this video is essentially to give you some top tips and some real good advice on exam technique and what you can do before your case study is released. So sit back, relax, and hopefully enjoy the video and take on board the advice that we're going to give you. Okay, so let's take our first look at some exam technique, and specifically the golden rules. And these rules are going to run through the veins of all the things that I discussed during this video. So let's start with number one, reading the question carefully at least twice and being sure you know what you're being asked to do. Always relate your answers to the information specifically to the client in mind. And thirdly, make sure you provide the right level of detail to guarantee each and every mark available. Now, I appreciate it's easy for me to list those three things and just read them out, do those things on exam day, and all will be well. But what we're going to be doing over the course of this video is bringing them to life with some real examples. So in the main types of questions that you're going to be asked during your exam, we'll take a look at the first two in conjunction together. So we're going to be looking at additional information or fact-finding together with factors or considerations. You might be sitting there thinking, why have I just seen a picture of a bottle of red sauce and brown sauce? And I wouldn't blame you. I'll get back to that in a second. First of all, fact-finding your exam. Some good news that there's always a fact-finding question, which is essentially gaining further information. Okay, but there's a couple of ways that they can ask that question. It could be further information, extra information, or information that's needed in order to give advice in an area. So rather than thinking of red sauce and brown sauce, it's the other sauce that I'm concerned with really, which is SOURCE. And what I mean by that in plain English is, who are you allowed to ask for that information? Essentially, is it the client or is it the policy provider or the pension scheme, for example? Okay, if it's the client, they might word the question specifically, what questions would you ask the client? Or if it was the provider, they might say, what further information would you need from the pension scheme administrator? Again, another example. Or they might keep it rather loose and say just what further information would you need. So if they don't specify the source in the exam, then that means you can go at both parties there, i.e. the client or the provider of the plan. However, if they do specify the source, then you have to go down that route. So if we take pensions as an example then, if it was what questions would you ask the client, then we would ask them, as long as we didn't know it, things like what's their attitude to risk, their capacity for loss, their state pension provision situation, for example, along with other things like what lump sums they might need and what level of income they might need. And the scheme or the provider of the plan would have no idea to the answers to those questions. Likewise, a client wouldn't know, for example, the funding status of a DB scheme, or whether it's in surplus or deficit maybe, and details around the commutation factor for tax-free cash. But just some examples there. So when you get that fact-finding question in your exam, before you start writing down, it's a really good idea to think about who is the source, who am I allowed to ask? Is it the clients? Is it the provider? Or is it both of them? And then detail your answers in that format. Typical fact-finding question might be worth 8 to 10 marks, but the good news is there'll always be extra marks available on the marking scheme. So I call it the 50% rule, so you know what's coming. So if you see 10 marks available, your target should be for 15 answers, okay? Because there's likely to be 13, 14 at least on the marking scheme, and that gives you more of a chance then to get tuned in to that senior examiner and their way of thinking. So that was fact-finding. Next is another really important question style which is absolutely guaranteed to come up in your exam, which is factors to consider. I'm going to compare it to fact-finding in a moment, but first of all, what is a factor to consider? Well, it's just essentially a really important piece of information which needs discussion and needs to be highlighted to the client. And you never have to rank those in order of importance. So what's the difference then between fact-finding, which we discussed earlier, and factors to consider? Well, fact-finding is just hard facts. It's just information, data, whatever you want to call it. Whereas a factor is an issue that needs discussing, but it also needs explaining to the examiner in order to make sure you get those marks. So, on the information you get before the exam, some of those factors will be in that information, but not all of them, usually around half. But if you just list those factors, then you're going to do yourself out of a mark there. You have to find the factor and then bring it to life by linking it to the client details that you get in your information. So for example, a factor to consider when transferring from a DB final salary arrangement into a DC arrangement is always going to be attitude to risk. But simply listing that as a factor is very unlikely to get the mark. So an example of bringing it to life might be the client has a cautious attitude to risk and they have only 7 years to go to retirement and they have a shortfall of £100,000, which is going to be really difficult to achieve. So that's an example of identifying a factor, an important thought process that needs to be taken through by both the advisor and the client, and bringing it to life with some information that you already know that's in the information you get before the exam. So I hope that makes sense. So the difference between fact-finding and factors is that you actually repeat some of the information that you receive before the exam that you've got in your documentation, whereas with fact-finding, you don't do that, because if you already know it, then why would you ask a question about it? So that was factors. Next, we're going to take a look at an absolute favourite with the CII, recommend and justify. Now, another guaranteed question style which is going to be asked of you in your exam is recommend and justify, which in plain English is you need to tell the client what to do and back that up with some justification. Normally these marks are, reasonably high for these questions, normally into double figures, so, 12 marks, even as high as 16, so really, really important questions. And as a general rule of thumb, you're looking at half the marks available for the actual recommendation itself, and the other half the marks for the justification or backing up those recommendations. So that might be, for example, recommending waiver of premium on a life policy would get 1 mark, and then saying it's to protect the premiums if the client were to become unable to work due to sickness or accident would be the justification of that. Or recommending stocks and shares ISA, again another mark for a recommendation for an investment, and the rationale is going to provide tax-free income and tax-free growth. Again, a solid justification there. So just some examples there. A really good idea in terms of how to approach this question and how to set it out really. You can recommend and justify as you go, so taking each component and backing that up with your justification, or alternatively you could put half the screen or half the page aside for your recommendations and then underneath or to the side of that provide all the justifications. So when you're practicing with past papers and when you get your exam materials, then it's a good idea to have an approach on how to answer a recommend and justify. My top tip would be don't be woolly or sit on the fence. Don't give the client options such as they could have or they might want to think about. They want you to be brave and actually make a physical recommendation, just like you would in a suitability or when you were with a client, and then back that up with some solid technical justifications. So that was recommend and justify. Then onto another guaranteed question style, benefits and drawbacks, or advantages and disadvantages. Next on the list is another really popular question of benefits and drawbacks, or often asked as advantages and disadvantages. Normally they ask for an equal amount of both, and in the question it will specifically tell you that. So for example, 4 advantages and 4 disadvantages. And then you get 8 marks for that. But the first thing to say is that you always go for more, just like with the fact finding, because on the marking scheme there's likely to be at least 1 extra mark on each side of the advantages and disadvantages, sometimes 2. So my goal there would be that 50% rule, so they're asking me for 4 of each. Easy for me to say, but I'd be going for 6 because that's likely to be the amount on the marking scheme. What you've also got to be careful to do is not to kind of like try and double up on the marks by putting an advantage and then talking about the exact opposite on the other side as a disadvantage. So for example, saying that there's investment risk on one side because they're in a high risk portfolio, but then on the other side of things saying, there's potential for massive capital growth there. So you need to watch out for that. But otherwise, you need to get short, straight to the point, using bullet points, and looking just for some key phrases to give those most important advantages and disadvantages of an arrangement. So it could be to do with the product, it could be to do with flexi access drawdown versus lifetime annuity, for example, or a term assurance versus a family income benefit. You can literally compare and contrast multiple things when it comes to our financial services world. But by looking back on past papers, you'll see how often that's been asked and the style of answer that they're after there. So benefits and drawbacks, or advantages and disadvantages, another key question style. Now on to one of the more simple styles of questions: list, state, or identify. All these three verbs have the same meaning for what the examiner wants to do for you in the exam. Next, we have list, state, or identify. All of those three verbs meaning basically the same thing. The examiner here just wants you to tell them, with no explanation as to why. So a classic example here might be listing 7 assets that are exempt from CGT. You'll get marks then for ISAs, gilts, etc. All those CG, main residents and things like that. Okay, but what you can't think is that essentially they are always one-word answers. That's a common mistake. So for example, VCT, that's all you need to put because that's an exempt asset. But if you were to write EIS, then you would need to follow that up with, after a 3-year period of holding. So you have to put, enough detail in order to guarantee yourself that mark. So not just one-word answers. It has to, explain the point and making sure that you demonstrate your knowledge. So list, state, and identify. So no essays to be written there, and very, very short and sharp bullet points. But sometimes can be one-word answers. But like I said, it has to detail enough information so you have demonstrated your understanding of that topic. So that's list, state, and identify. Now on to some of the more challenging questions, that being explain, describe, and outline. Okay, next on our question journey is explain, describe, and outline. So I'm going to group those into 2 little subgroups first of all. So I'm going to keep explain and describe together because they're essentially the same thing, and then I'm going to come back to outline in a very short while. So with explain and describe, that's what I call the techie question. In terms of level of detail here, if it was out of 10, the examiner is looking for an 11 or even a 12. It's like they're trying to imagine that you have that textbook in front of you when you're answering this exam. So it has to be extremely technical and absolutely on the money. Okay, so at least we know that's expected of us. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy to do, but very technical answers which are mostly going to be linked to both products and processes. So products, again, you could have a flex access drawdown or junior ISAs or lifetime ISAs even. When it comes to processes, typical ones there are going to be pension death benefits, for example, or the laws of intestacy for a certain set of clients. So products and processes is where your explain and your describe comes into play. And they're looking for keywords there. So, for example, on pension death benefits, if a client was in a flex access drawdown and they died, and they were to ask you to explain what options the wife would had or his wife would had upon his death, what you would not get away with is, the wife could carry on with the drawdown arrangement. That's just a bit too woolly or very woolly for an explain question. They require the specifics there, so dependents flexi access drawdown, a dependents lifetime annuity, and obviously the lump sum. So an example there of trying to visualize what that textbook would look like in terms of level of detail. When it comes to outline, this is a little bit annoying, so they can ask the same question but replace the word explain or describe with outline instead. So kind of like by logic there, you can't have much more detail. Well, you can't have more detail than explain or describe, so they're looking for less detail and will reward you with less marks. So explaining in detail someone's pension death benefits that are available might be worth 10 marks, but outlining those pension death benefits might be worth, say, 6 marks. Okay, Don't worry about how much less marks it is, because you'll find that out on the day. But what we do know is that we can't second guess what the examiner will allow you to leave out as if you were answering an explained question. So for example, the pensions I just talked about then, it might mean that you don't need the word dependent to go with the flexi access drawdown. But the answer is, you would know about as much as I do on that one. We'd both be guessing. So what we recommend that you do when you see that outline is that you treat that like a describe or explain question and go for the highest level of detail possible. Don't leave anything to chance. Belt and braces approach here. Okay? That doesn't mean that you're writing double the amount. It just means wherever possible you're trying to visualize that textbook, yeah, and you're just trying to really, really, really make it watertight. So that's the advice we give there. Describe, explain, and outline. Treat them all the same, although with outline, what you're probably doing is just going belt and braces and going that extra mile. And in your exam, you know what? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You'll never get marked down for that. Now on to one that we don't have to worry about too much for this exam. Calculate, showing all of your workings. Quite a short one to talk about this one. Calculate, showing all your workings. So if you were to look back on past papers, yeah, you will see, very, very, very rarely is a calculation question asked in this exam. And when it is, it tends to be, just from prevalence, if you like, it tends to be the inheritance tax calculation. So what we recommend that you do is obviously make sure you sharpen your saw on your IHT knowledge. But the good news is that the information that you get before the exam would give you the information that you need in order to practice that calculation before you actually got into the exam hall or you were being remotely invigilated. Okay, so practice your IHT, because when a calculation is asked, that's the most likely one to be. Normally worth 6 to 8 marks, like I say, when it is asked, rarely. And again, you're going to get marks for showing all of your workings there. So rather than deducting, one figure for 2 nil rate bands and 2 residence nil rate bands, the examiner wants to understand that that there will be 2 nil rate bands available plus 2 residence nil rate bands. So clearly mark what you're doing. So if you do make a mistake, method marks can be given for you. So that was calculate, showing all of your workings. And finally, one of the more challenging questions, given examiner's feedback anyway, is comment on. Okay, and last but by no means least, what I call the problem question or the problem child of this exam, which is going to be comment on. Because you're probably thinking already, what is a comment? One person's comment is going to be different to somebody else's. So they're normally asking you here to comment on a certain area of financial planning. You'll never see a question that says comment on their financial arrangements. That's too generic. It'll be more likely to be commenting on a particular need area, like protection, retirement planning, or inheritance tax planning, for example. So just going down one level into a specific area of financial planning. In plain English, what they're asking you to do here is to summarise the information that you already have and pick out the areas which are relevant to that need area. Make a short comment on any shortfalls or any pitfalls or anything that they're doing incorrectly, and then clearly tell the client or tell the examiner what they are lacking in that area. So protection's a good example here, and there's been information released for previous exams where the clients were earning, say, £80,000 a year each, and they had a joint life first death level term assurance for £100,000. And it only had 4 years to go, and their children were still under the age of 5, if I remember rightly. So still a good 15, 16 years of financial dependency there. So kind of answers which went along for that model answer were along the lines of the clients have a level term assurance in place, the sum assured is way too low for what they need, and the term's not long enough. Okay, so it was just these high-level, short shock tactics, if you like, in order to, kind of like jumpstart the client into taking some action. You can look at it that way. So I don't know if you noticed that I didn't ask any questions. I didn't ask why it was only £100,000 or why it's only got 4 years to go. Because if they want you to ask questions, that's a fact-finding question, which we've already discussed. Neither did I make any recommendations there. I didn't recommend a sum assured to them. I didn't recommend the term needs to be for at least another 16 years, for example, and start talking about waiver of premium. or adding on indexation, for example, because that is a recommendation with a justification. So comment on sits in its own little area, if you like, and for the first time today, I'm really going to say you need to keep it high level rather than the devil in the detail. And make as many comments as you like. And if I use protection again, an example, so if from the information you've got before your exam, it's clear that the clients haven't got any critical illness cover, and it's clear they haven't got any income protection, then you would make those comments. You have no income protection, you have no critical illness, for example. So again, by looking back at past papers, you will see that comment on question, and you will see that the level of detail in the model answers is not that high. It's very, very spread thinly, if you like, but covers a lot of areas. So the biggest mistakes with those is to ask questions, but that's fact finding, or to make recommendations. We don't do either of those, because if they want you to do that, I know I go on, that's what they'll ask you to do. So with comment on, it's just that kind of like helicopter or bird's eye view, if you like, and keeping it quite high level, you know, to shock the client, if you like, or to create the agenda to have a face-to-face meeting with them. So that was our final question style, which was comment on. So back to golden rule number 1, reading the question carefully at least twice and being sure that you know what you're being asked to do. So what I'd like to do now, I'm going to bring up an example question onto the screen. I don't want you to answer the question, we'll be looking at that later. What I'd like you to do is imagine you in the exam, and I would like you to think about which words are really, really important. So which are the golden words or the buzzwords that you'd look to highlight in your exam, draw a line under, or just make sure that they're important to you. So if I bring a question up now, so pause the video, have a think about it, only a few words there, and have a think about which are the really important words and why. And then we'll go through it. Okay, so time to see how you did. So I've highlighted the keywords or the buzzwords here in red, as you can see. So first of all, we have recommend and justify. If you just read it as recommend, then you're more than likely to miss out on about half the marks. Because in CII world, half the marks tend to be for the recommendation, and the other half of the marks tend to be for the justification of those recommendations. Then I've highlighted next Tom and Lisa's. So, even though the clients might both have a need, the examiner may ask you for one of the clients or for both of the clients. So please answer the question that's being asked. So in this example, we'll be looking to recommend and justify for Tom and Lisa, and that will have a bearing on the basis of the plan recommended. Notice the next one is for personal protection needs. So it's likely to either be for personal, or they could use the word family protection, or it's going to be for the mortgage. It won't be for their entire debt and non-debt needs. We're essentially looking for the words personal or family, which is essentially non-mortgage, or specifically linked to lending, i.e. mortgage. And finally, we have in the event of a serious illness. So in CII language, the good news is that death is just death. They won't change the words there. Serious illness means critical illness. And then long-term illness means income protection. So hopefully you'll agree with me there, by either misreading or missing out one of those keywords there, it'll be very easy to score badly in that question, even if your technical knowledge was up to speed. Because if you forget justify, recommend and justify for the wrong person, recommend and justify for the wrong type of need, i.e. did the mortgage instead of their personal or family protection, and worst of all, recommending for long-term illness or income protection instead of critical illness, then the marks would seriously start to slip away. So I recommend that you underline or highlight those keywords before you start answering the question, and my justification for that is that you are less likely than to miss out on those keywords or misinterpret them, and just have a higher probability of being tuned in to the question being asked. Okay, so on to golden rule number 2. They're always relating your answers to the information specifically to the clients in mind. So as you already know, your exam is going to be based on clients that you have some information on. And there's very specific information that they give you. So always try and edge your answers and tune in to those clients. For example, if you were to be asked how one of your clients obtains income tax relief on their personal pension plan, as an example, what you don't do is talk about all the different tax statuses available, like non-basic, higher and additional rate, because your client will have a specific tax rate which you will already know. So you have to tune in to that tax status and just worry about that and ignore what's not applicable to that client. So the information that you usually get is very specific things on like their health, their investments, their investment experience, any ethical views. There's lots and lots of examples, but what I'm trying to say is that you tune in to those clients and those clients alone. Marks which are not awarded for information which is not applicable to the clients in your exam. Now on to that final golden rule, making sure you provide the right detail to guarantee each and every mark. After all, this is a high-level exam and they're not going to reward you with marks for generic and half-hearted attempts at some technical answers. So for example, some of the common marks that are lost here is not even detailing the kind of tax which is applicable to the client. So if I use an example as an EIS, to say that it has 30% tax relief is not going to hit the mark. As we all know, it's income tax relief. And that's not awarded in a particular year, because a year can be any 12-month period. It's a tax year. So you need to write tax year or 1920, 2021, whichever tax year that you're talking about. It's really, really important. So you have to be absolutely exact in what you're thinking about, so the examiner has no chance in their own mind of thinking that you might mean something else or that you don't know. So it's about that right level of detail, because this is not multiple choice. You can't just tick a box. If you don't write it down, it will be assumed that you don't know it. So that right detail to guarantee each and every mark.